Thank you. And thank you also to Bangalore, the city, and the Lit Fest, the team, and especially Shiny for inviting me here and this wonderful conversation, which I've really enjoyed your book, Nikhil, because having traveled so much and worked in the Northeast over a couple of decades, it sort of took me back to all of that. And there were so many points of interest that I thought about when I was reading it, because it also coalesces with so much of the history of the country, and also points at which there have been fractures. So let's talk about some of those things. And if we can begin actually with the title, a title that I must say I haven't quite liked, but I'd really like you to talk about it and the reason for putting it down as If I Have to Be a Soldier. Because it's also sort of doubtful. Why do I have to be a soldier?
Good question. Um, the My original manuscript was called "The Wailing of the Bamboo," and that was the theme because the insurgency gets triggered when the bamboo flowers once every 48 years, and it was the pain that gets triggered as a result of that. But my publisher felt that this is a strong book of military fiction, and that in a bookstore people like to know, from the title, what to expect. So if I have to be a soldier is a happy compromise. I'm okay with it. I think it's worked in some senses.
The second question, which I think you've been asked innumerable times, but I think we should still go there, is this is your first work of fiction, and why did you decide to go to the Northeast? Why did Mizoram call you? And then with Mizo history, this is literally the darkest chapter of their history. Not many people know about the 20 years of trouble that the state went through. What excited you about it?
Well, look, I've traveled a lot in the Northeast over the years, and as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, first and foremost, one is always looking for powerful stories to tell of interesting characters, of times of trouble, perhaps, but powerful stories. And I have been very fascinated by the story of the insurgency in Mizoram, which, read my book, the figure got triggered when the bamboo flowered. With this particular species flowers once every 48 years, right? And that triggers a rat plague, and then that leads to a famine, and then finally there's an uprising. But that's on the superficial side, right? Deeper, it's a story of identity. It's a story of of people taken for granted over a long period of time, and finally the insurgency being literally the last straw, where the expression of frustration and anger gets expressed through an insurgency. So I found the story fascinating. I found the causality fascinating, and I thought it's time that mainstream India also, learns about the Northeast, and this is a way of doing it through a fictional novel, but set against real world historical events.
A little bit about also the peripheries and the fact that mainland India, so-called mainland India, really doesn't know anything about them. I mean, it's always being said that you can't even name the seven sisters and brother, the late entrant. These stories of the peripheries and how important they are in nation building, for example, because almost I think every state in that region has had some insurgency, because they themselves have a thought of themselves as a nation, and they were sort of rudely sidelined after independence. So something about nation building and themselves.
Absolutely right. I think very few people in India really know much about the Northeast or spend any time, exploring it or even trying to understand its culture and history. For most people, the Northeast is basically up to Assam, perhaps, and everything beyond that is a homogeneous mass of, of these little states. Most people believe that there's terrible troubles all over the Northeast. There's insurgency and there's violence, and there's, it's not the kind of place that you would want to go to without putting your life at risk. That's what some people believe. So that's again at a superficial level. I think from a nation building perspective, it is critically important to tell the stories of places and characters, not necessarily in our mainstream. I think it helps connect the nation better. It helps us understand each other better. And insurgency can only be tackled when you understand the other person's perspective, with the other point of view, right, with an open mind. So to that extent, I think yes, stories of the Northeast told in a perhaps in a more massy mainstream manner will help connect the Northeast better to the rest of India.
And so the contemporary relevance, if you want to call it that, of the book coming out at this time, because we have a lot of stuff happening over the past more than a year now in Manipur. There are outbursts in various other places, as they have been in the last few years. Even in Assam, we've been, sort of the CAA and all of that. But Manipur at present, the contemporariness of the novel as well, because you're talking about one insurgency, but it's not necessarily not connected to the others.
I think all these issues in the Northeast are linked, and I think they go back to independence, right? Where when we got independence, I think our leaders were very preoccupied with a lot of stuff that was happening in mainstream India, whether it was, Kashmir, or whether it was the pains of partition, and the Northeast kind of was a sideshow, so to speak, but no one really had too much time to, really understand the issues. And as you said earlier, a lot of these so-called small states actually see themselves as nations, right? So if you go back, you take a look at Manipur now, right? Manipur is actually the first state in India that had an adult franchise election, way back in 1948. The Maharaja called for election after independence, and an assembly was elected. When the assembly got elected, one of the first resolutions they passed was, hey, we don't want to merge into India, right? We want to be an independent nation, just like Burma, or just like at that time Sikkim and other countries in smaller Bhutan countries in the region. So the Indian government response to that was to send the army in, put the Maharaja under house arrest, right, and declare that Manipur had merged into the Indian Union. Now that was just a starting point, because the Nagas had the same issues, the Mizos had the same issues. Right? In '67, we dealt with the Nagaland crisis and the insurgency by giving Nagaland its own state. But it was a truncated state, because in order to make sure that they didn't become too powerful, you left a large number of Nagas in Manipur, you left a large number of Nagas in Assam, you left them in Arunachal. You never gave them the state that they wanted, right? Because you thought it would become too powerful and difficult to control. So as a result of which, even today, the Naga insurgency continues. Similarly, in Mizoram, the Mizos wanted independence. They settled eventually in 1986 for a state within the Indian Union. That same state could have been given to them in '66, right? And we could have done away with 20 years of violence and insurgency. So I think, yes, it is topical, because the issues have been on boil since independence. We've turned a blind eye to them. We don't think it's important. But what is happening in Manipur today is only a manifestation of that neglect over a long period of time, which is now completely out of control. And frankly, the options that you have available now are very limited.
So also, like you said, that things could have been resolved earlier. So there are also, I think it's also in writing in certain places where Lal Denga of the MNF actually wanted to sign this agreement and become part of the country much earlier, and yet it didn't happen. And then there was this entire 20-year period of the Rambai and him and others escaping, going away to Myanmar and Pakistan and so on and so forth. So tell me a little bit about that, this whole thing about wanting to actually accede much earlier.
I think our politicians across all political parties have got away for far too long with issues in the Northeast, saying it's sensitive because it's a border area, so we have to deal with this very differently, very sensitively. But sensitivity, I think, it just meant apathy for like 50 or 60 years, where you've done nothing about issues that have been simmering for a long period of time. And absolutely right, Lal Denga, etc. The insurgency that ended when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister in '86 and signed the Mizo Accord could actually have ended a lot earlier, but the political climate in Delhi wasn't perhaps responsive at that point in time, right? There were just too many people stuck in very fixed positions, and you were not willing to sit down at the table and actually have a discussion. Plus, there were local political parties or local leaders, whether it is of the Congress or of the other political parties, who also felt that a conversation with the MNF would reduce their power, right, in the state. So there were a lot of different issues, I think. But absolutely, this insurgency could have ended a lot earlier. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, I think it's fantastic that today Mizoram is one of the most peaceful states in all of India, right? And on all parameters, whether it's education, whether it's, you take anything, it's amongst India's most advanced states. And the insurgency is over. It is an oasis of peace when you compare it to what's happening in, Manipur or even Nagaland. And that accord has actually worked and stood the test of time.
Yeah, the accord has worked, and it's actually been quite amazing because the MNF was not only given pardon, but they all came above ground and returned from all these various places that they were in, and started living life as normal civilians. So that, I think, doesn't normally happen. That's quite amazing. The other thing that I wanted to ask you was that, being an outsider, because being an insider and an outsider, especially in those areas, is always such a big, it's like this camel's back thing. And so, how did you tackle that?
That was definitely a point of concern for me. Even after the novel came out, I was uncomfortable because I wasn't sure how it would be received in Mizoram. So I did do a tour of Mizoram. We went to a lot of colleges and schools and met a lot of people and actually traveled with the book. And I was really pleasantly surprised and happy that that wasn't an issue. They never saw it as an issue. And I think the reason for that is my central character, Sammy, is actually an outsider. Although born of a Mizo mother, he's treated as an outsider right through. And his cultural context is Mangalorean, right? Like me. So I could relate, I could write about that character in a meaningful, personal way. And plant him in an environment that, not alien to him, was still, an environment that pushed back at him for being an outsider, right? So, through that context, through that device, I think I managed to walk the fine tightrope, of not seeming like I'd culturally appropriated someone else's history or culture, because my central character is an outsider, right? In that context.
I remember when traveling in Mizoram, especially, and because in the north, many people like me, Punjabis, have this whole thing of, we carry this baggage of partition, for example, having come from somewhere else, being migrants, being refugees, and we've always heard these stories in our families. Our nannies and dadis and our mothers have constantly recounted these stories. So I found it quite amazing that in the course of travels in Mizoram, and whenever I would ask people to talk about this very difficult time, there was mostly silence. So did you encounter that, and how did you work around the silencing, and also talk about the silencing especially of things that happened with women and sexual violence against women?
Yeah, so I think I found that also a little disconcerting when we traveled in Mizoram. Not many people were comfortable talking about the period of insurgency. And I think I realized that it is actually a point of conflict within Mizo society, because you have to remember that there are also a large number of Mizos who didn't support the insurgents. In fact, they had family members, etc., killed by the insurgents, right? So there is a fracture when it comes to that entire period. And people, I think, are uncomfortable talking about it because it opens those old wounds, especially people were young adults at that period of time. So in schools and colleges, in fact, there were a lot of younger people who actually said, look, at home we don't talk about this. My parents don't want to talk about it, and I'm learning about what happened to us through your book, right? And you are an outsider, and I'm learning from an outsider about what happened. And I think the reason is that parents, people who grew up at that time, are actually, it was traumatic, it was disturbing. There was tremendous amounts of violence, especially against women, right, who typically bear the brunt of violence in most, insurgencies and troubled areas. And I think also if you look at the kind of trauma that society in Mizoram underwent at that time, 80% of the Mizo population was relocated at gunpoint from their villages burnt, and they were moved to these camps along the highway where the army could control and keep an eye, on them. The entire villages, etc., burnt. 80% of the population, right? So they've lost their homes, they've lost their cultural moorings, they've lost, their history, right? It's all burnt, right? And I talk about, the novel dwells on a lot of those aspects of, of Mizo culture, Mizo society at that time. But undoubtedly, it was a very violent time. Thousands lost their lives on both sides, the armed forces as well as insurgents, as well as civilians. And yes, a lot of, I think women really bore the brunt of what happened in those days.
And another thing that's interesting, because you've also, like you said right in the beginning, that also it's being positioned as military novel or something like that. So the army and the security forces and how you talk about them or how you portray them in your book. Of course, it's all shades of grey. There is no black and white, but nevertheless, saying things like this about the army or about, frontier force, as it's called, the Assam Rifles or whatever it might be, the bombing of Aizawl, this regrouping thing that happened with all the villages, the burning of churches. There's so much stuff that I think we need to say sorry for, and to be really contrite and ask for forgiveness from the Mizo people. What about that? Talk about that a bit.
Yeah. Mizoram is the only time in our history where our Air Force has bombed its own people, right? During the insurgency, when it first started, the Indian Air Force went in and bombed Aizawl. Everyone knows it happens. There's evidence, it's anecdotal, people have lived through it. But till today, we don't accept that actually took place, right? The government of India does not accept that actually took place. The Air Force does not accept that it actually took place, and that's where we are. So it's just denial, right? Having said that, my central character is an army man, okay, and I think he comes out in a shine. He comes out as a strong character, with his moral compass completely intact, who follows through on his conscience, right? And actually, I think gives the Indian Army a good name. Having said that, there are events that can't be washed away and can't be denied. The destruction of villages, the bombing of Aizawl, the violence that took place, that can't be denied. That is a fact, of what took place in those years. And yes, I think certainly, historically there have been more than enough precedents of governments and leaders apologizing for things that they weren't directly responsible for, but took place, 30, 40, 50, even 100 years earlier. Because it just acknowledges the hurt, it acknowledges the injustice, right? It doesn't solve anything, but it actually acknowledges an injustice that was committed, maybe much before your time, nothing that you could do about it.
Yeah, definitely think so, because I'm sure you met lots of people there in the course of research that you would have done, and I know you said that it was during the COVID years, so there was not as much travel that you could do, but definitely I don't think we have, time's up. So, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that, Nikhil, because
thank you.
Like I said, and the book is such a page turner, it's like you can't put it down once you start. It's got all the elements of also becoming a film or a series or something.
Let's see. Thank you.